Okay, here we are at Chapter 8, Monitoring and Reporting. It's a long chapter, so let's get to it. Introduction, Trust but Verify. This statement was made famous by President Ronald Reagan in 1987 after signing the Intermediate Range Nuclear Treaty with the USSR. Not treaty, but treaty. Monitoring, verifying, documenting, and reporting risk treatment results, as well as the performance of overall risk management efforts, are vitally important in managing an organization's operational risks. How else can an organization be certain that their resources and efforts have been put to good use and that the intended results are achieved and maintained? Like other aspects of the business, risk management performance must be monitored, measured, and communicated to be properly managed. In this chapter, the elements of monitoring, reviewing, documenting, and reporting are covered. Here you go. There's your famous ladder, what do you call it, risk management process, risk assessment, and then over here on the right, monitoring review. That's where we're at. Primary goals of monitoring and reporting in a risk management framework are to measure the implementation and performance of risk assessment, risk treatment, and overall risk management, and establish effective metrics to achieve risk reduction objectives within the organization. Monitoring and reporting elements are found not only in the risk management process, but are also a significant component of established management system models, which are highlighted in the following section. The Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. The continual improvement process is built upon the Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA cycle, oftentimes referred to as Plan, Do, Study, Act, developed by Walter Shewhart and later promoted by Dr. Edward Deming. Occupational health and safety management systems, as well as the risk management process, are based on a continual improvement process using this model, which is illustrated in Figure 8.2, continuous improvement. So it says here you plan, and then implementation, checking and corrective action, management review, policy management, leadership, and employee participation, and you improve and reduce hazards, risk, incidents, comp costs, workers' comp costs, lost time, and you improve employee health and safety, productivity, satisfaction, and image. So that's continuous improvement. Within the check component of the PDA cycle, the model requires organizations to monitor, measure, and evaluate key performance indicators. We'll talk about those KPIs later on. Audit for compliance with established policies, review progress and effectiveness of corrective actions, and record, report, and communicate findings to decision makers and affected stakeholders. The checking process. Ongoing checking, monitoring, and measuring efforts are required to ensure risk management implementations are working and continue to work as intended, as well as learn from and make refinements and improvements to the system. An organization's monitoring and checking process should be integrated into all aspects of risk management. Some of the checking activities within risk management are defined in ISO Guide 73, Vocabulary for Risk Management, as follows. Monitoring, continual checking, supervising, critically observing or determining the status in order to identify change from the performance level required or expected. Review, activity undertaken to determine the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the subject matter to achieve established objectives. Risk reporting, form of communication intended to inform particular internal or external stakeholders by providing information regarding the current state of risk and its management. Checking process continued. Risk register, record of information about identified risks. Note the term risk log is sometimes used instead of risk register. We'll talk about that later too. Risk profile, description of any set of risks. Note the set of risks can contain those that relate to the whole organization, part of the organization, or as otherwise defined. The checking process, risk management audit, systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining evidence and evaluating it objectively in order to determine the extent to which the risk management framework or any selected part of it is adequate and effective. Risk management checking functions, such as those mentioned, allow an organization to know the status of their risk management efforts and residual risks. Developing plans for monitoring and reporting. Effective monitoring and checking functions must be integrated into the system. Information gathered from these checking duties is necessary and must be reported to affected decision makers and stakeholders to manage the process. Key metrics and performance indicators must be identified and included in the process to ensure continuous improvement is maintained. The following are summaries of best practices and elements that should be factored into the monitoring and reporting process. Monitoring review plan, recording and reporting plan, define responsibilities and accountabilities, adjust for changes to content, control effectiveness. Monitoring review plan, a written plan providing the purpose and scope, goals and objectives, roles and responsibilities, and resources and schedule, as well as other necessary information. It's really important in any time of planning thing that you assign goals and objectives for sure, but roles and responsibilities. Don't just say, we're going to do this. Just say, okay, you're going to do this, or you and you are going to do this as a team, but you're going to have somebody's going to have the responsibility to get it done, or else it won't get done. Identify recording needs, such as specific information on reports, frequency and schedule of reports, methods of reporting, report distribution. Same thing here. If you don't say who's going to do the report, it won't get done. Define responsibilities and accountabilities. Specific duties, responsibilities, and accountability measures should be defined and communicated to responsible parties and affected stakeholders. Random or scheduled duties, such as site observation, auditing, interviewing, sampling, tracking, measuring, evaluating, documenting, and reporting. Duties should be specific, measurable, time-based, and relevant to the purpose and scope. Adjust for changes to context. Things change. It may be necessary to reassess previously assessed operations or to apply different risk treatments. Control effectiveness. This is very important. Monitoring the effectiveness of implementing risk treatment controls as well as their reliability should include scheduled checks and surveillance based on the criticality of the risk and should be tracked to ensure completion. Should include the checks or tests indicated on the next slide. Control effectiveness checks or tests. The control is well designed. Review the design criteria. Is it designed for what it's supposed to do? Does it fit? Control exists and it's operational. Visual inspection. Okay, we said we were going to put this guard over here. Does it fit? It's there? Is it operational? Does it work? Is there problems with it? Can you reach around it? Type of thing. Control is performing as intended. Make sure it works as it's supposed to. You got a light curtain. Does it work? You try it. You put something through it, see if it stops the machine. Control is reliable. Check potential deviations, bypasses, or failures. This, you might have to do this by watching it for quite a while, or go back to what I said many, many times. Ask the people that are there. Does this thing work? Because it's their fingertips, their hands, their lives, perhaps, maybe, that are going to be in danger if it doesn't. So they have a stake in this, and they have to understand that. Control is not creating other hazards, unintended effects. They talked about earplugs in a place with backup alarms. Control is sustainable. Degree of ongoing maintenance, calibration, service, or other needs, and their frequency. In other words, it's something you can live with. It's going to be able to, it's not prohibitive to sustain it, to keep it going. Testing, verifying, and validating. Where practicable, analyses results should be verified, checking to see that the analysis was performed correctly, and validated, checking that the correct analysis was conducted. Verification and validation are independent procedures that are used together for checking that a product, service, or system meets requirements and specifications, and that it fulfills its intended purpose. Key performance indicators are a set of quantifiable measures that a company uses to gauge its performance over time. These metrics are used to determine a company's progress in achieving its strategic and operational goals, and also to compare a company's finance and performance against other businesses within industry. Now, this term KPI, key performance indicators, is relatively new. It's one of those terms they just drummed up to give a fancy name to something that we've been doing all along. I mean, if you're in a production operation, for example, you're going to have some kind of measurement, like units per labor hour, or dollars billed versus labor dollars, or something like that. You're going to have those indicators and have been using them for decades. And before this KPI came along, it's the same thing. It's just a fancy word. It's something quantifiable. In other words, not just good, bad. It's numbers, something you can put a number on. And that's, like I said, in any production operation, it's output versus some criteria, either labor or whatever, or total costs too. It could be that too. So there's a lot. Some of them are broad, like the whole plant cost, maybe for the whole plant's output, or it could be by department. It could be by even an operator, a person, or a piece of equipment. So, but these have been there for practically ever, and this KPI is just a fancy word for them. As part of the monitoring and measuring component of the risk management system, performance measures and their indicators must be identified and included in the measurement strategy. Key performance indicators are targeted and measured to provide the organization performance information on the organization's strategic objectives. KPIs provide the organization an indication of how well they are doing in achieving their objectives. Key performance indicators focus on performance measures important to the organization's objectives and are used to measure the level of achievement towards those objectives. To adequately monitor and manage risk, a second type of indicator is needed: key risk indicators. Key risk indicators focus on risk measures that provide indications of emerging risks. KRIs are used to identify and locate emerging risks and identify the need to act. KRIs and risk metrics are used in risk profiles and other risk tracking methods to understand severity and likelihood levels within the organization. While performance indicators provide insight into risks already well known by the organization, key risk indicators, KRIs, are used to provide early warning of new emerging risks by looking at known risks and leading indicators or triggers in the organization. Such KRIs can be used to develop strategies to identify and manage newly discovered risks. Risk indicators are often identified through causal factor analysis or root cause analysis of previous events to understand causal factors and triggers that can indicate potential risk. Causal factor is just the same thing as a root cause. In addition, outside sources such as industry trends or developments, technology and research, economic indicators, and competitor actions can be helpful in developing KRIs. In order to verify and validate performance and results, documented records of performance must be maintained. For regulatory compliance officers, certifying agencies, and auditors charged with verifying compliance and performance, their general position is if it isn't documented, it doesn't exist. The same principle applies to the risk management process and applies to safety too. If you said, well, so they trained somebody, well, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So you have to document everything. And then it just makes sense. How else are you going to prove that you did it? The purpose of documents and records is to provide information about
unknown caller.
Sorry about that. About risk to decision makers and other stakeholders, provide a record and justification of decisions made, preserve the results of risk management efforts for future use and reference, enable verification of results, and provide an audit trail. Document names, titles, and qualification of the risk assessment team, the method employed, the hazards identified, and the risks assessed, and the risk controls implemented and follow-up actions taken. A common tool is the risk register, a spreadsheet used to document risk levels. More details on the risk register in the later part of this chapter. It's the same. This isn't long enough to do two parts on it. So I thought it was originally, but I think I'll make it all in one sitting. Who needs this information? A distribution list should be developed according to their needs and the frequency of reports. What information is needed? How often is it reported or needed? How is it reported? Emails, paper, whatever. The need of each decision maker and stakeholder should be considered when selecting reporting methods and distribution. Document reporting and communication. There we are, back to this again. Here's some of the ways you can do it. We're going to talk about them, of course. Methods used to monitor and report risk. All right, here we go. Number one, risk matrix. Compares individual risks by selecting a consequence and likelihood pair and displaying them on a matrix, with consequence on one axis and likelihood on the other. Matrices can be used to report information about the magnitude of risk from different sources to monitor risk performance. And when you're going to use risk matrices, it's going to be one of your basic tools in your toolbox. Risk register is a great idea, just recording them, and we'll talk about that later, but just keep a track of them. Wouldn't you do that anyhow? S-curve, bow tie, we're not talking about them too much. So, key performance indicators, we've talked about those. Key risk indicators, risk performance measurement, we're going to talk about that too later on. Monitoring effectiveness and risk-based decision-making. The final step in the risk-based decision-making process is monitoring effectiveness of the implemented decision. The goal of this step is to verify that the results of the decision are in alignment with what the organization has intended. This requires evaluating results, assessing their impact on the process, determining if the impact is as expected, and making adjustments or improvements if necessary, and communicating the results to decision makers and affected stakeholders. If monitoring indicates that the results are not acceptable or correctable, a new decision-making process must be considered. Monitoring for both immediate results and long-term results should be included. Using KPIs and KRIs, the results of the risk treatment can be measured and evaluated. A monitoring and reporting plan is an important method for managing results. It should identify how the implementation will be monitored, verified, and validated, who is responsible, timeframes, and resources. Stakeholder input is critical to the monitoring process. Stakeholders know the critical elements and concerns related to the implementation and should be asked to provide their views on how each step of the process is performed and suggestions for improvement. Now, again, in safety, if you biggest stakeholders, who are the people that are doing this? Who are working on this piece of equipment? Let's say, who are going to get hurt by it if it's something happens? They're stakeholders. Stakeholders and qualified subject matter experts can provide relevant information needed for assessments and information needed in the decision-making process. And they should be part of the whole process from step one. Stakeholders, qualified subject matter experts too, if you need them. A qualified subject matter expert can be the operator of that piece of equipment that you're working on or that operation that you're doing. They can be an expert. They're going to guarantee they're going to know more about it than you do. This will enable critical stakeholder buy-in and ownership for the final decisions. This is your risk-based decision-making. We talked about it before. Identify decision, determine context, decision makers, stakeholders, options, influential factors, assess the risk, make a decision, and monitor the effectiveness. Okay, this is something you're doing as a safety professional, probably just without even thinking about it. You're going to look at something. You're going to assess the risk. Geez, this person's doing something. Is it risky? How risky is it? They're 12 feet off the ground, and there's no. That's pretty risky. And make a decision. All right, we're going to get that. We're going to stop this operation right now because that person's got 12 foot off the ground with no fall protection, and then you're going to have a railing put up. Then you're going to go back and check it, make sure the monitor the effectiveness of it. That type of thing is going to go on in your mind all the time as there's a safety professional. Unfortunately, you can't get out of your mind sometimes. You'll be doing it when you go to the grocery store. But that's the way it goes. And that's in any business. Whatever it is you're doing, you're going to carry it through. So anyhow, now we're going to talk about tools used to monitor effectiveness for safety professionals. And the first one is key performance indicators and key risk indicators, which we've already talked about a good bit. Again, key performance indicators are performance metrics used to measure critical performance aspects that help an organization assess progress toward declared goals. KPIs provide an organization an indication of how they are doing in achieving their objectives. Okay, in the safety field, almost everybody has an objective as how many serious accidents, any accidents they have in general, and their accident rate, their OSHA rate, how many lost time accidents they have. And if your OSHA rate was 3.5 last year, you want it to be 3 this year. If you had 10 lost time accidents last year, you sure want that to be 0 this year, but you'd like to get it down to 5 at least. So that's a KPI that's in safety is like there all the time. Workers' comp costs too. Workers' comp costs, if they were $800,000 last year, you want them to get them down to $600,000 this year, or whatever. So. And there it can't be 0, but you want to get them as low as possible. So those are some of the KPIs that you're going to be using with on a daily basis almost. Key performance indicators are used to target and track performance of an organization's key operations and achievement of objectives. KPIs will differ between organizations as well as between departments in organizations, depending upon stakeholders' needs and objectives. For instance, net revenue or profitability may be considered business KPI, while OSH risk reduction or incident rate reduction may be considered safety-related KPIs. Key risk indicators can be considered precursors or factors that lead to potential risk. Selecting effective KRIs starts with understanding the organizational objectives and risk-related events that can affect the achievement of those objectives. Aligning OSH strategic initiatives with business objectives provides relevant information that might serve as leading indicator of an emerging risk. Connecting OSH risks to strategic initiatives can help the improvement team to identify the most critical metrics that can serve as leading key risk indicators. Leading KRIs are usually measurable in numbers, percentage, or dollar amounts, and support the decisions that need to be made. Risk management tool number 25. We're talking about that. See, next slide. There you go. Okay, this is the chart, whatever. Understand context of KPIs, KRIs. Understand objectives, identify task measures, identify key indicators, establish targets, measure key indicators, evaluate and adjust. I mean, most of this stuff in the beginning of this thing is, just you know what your OSHA rates or OSHA number of accidents, that type of your accident or incident history is going to be a big key KPI for the safety department, and production is going to be there for production department. And there's almost anything that can be measured can be electricity costs. It can be whatever. Development, implementation. Now we're talking about risk treatment tracking. The development, implementation, and maintenance of efficient and effective risk treatments is a primary goal of operational risk management. Once implemented, risk treatments must be monitored to ensure they are active, effective, and reliable. A tracking system provides structure and documentation of monitoring and the status of the risk treatment's performance. Such a system provides a closed loop by documenting the implementation of a recommended risk treatment and the resulting residual risk. As part of monitoring and reporting activities, the tracking of risk treatments implemented should be performed by an organization. Tracking and documenting systems can be developed to evaluate and track treatments by location, type of treatment, risk priority level, or other categories. In the process in constructing an effective tracking system for risk treatments, the organizations should consider its objectives, the overall context, available resources, and needs. Tracking systems can range from simple spreadsheets to detailed computer-based software programs that automate tracking, reporting, trending, charting, escalation, documentation, and approval of corrective or preventive actions. My guess is a simple spreadsheet is going to be used by most people. The following 6 slides are from table 8.2 on pages 217 to 218 of the book, Leading and Lagging Indicators, and these are adapted from UL, Underwriting Laboratories. We're going to go through these, and so you get, and the headings are all the same. Management system element, leading are input-based indicators and lagging output-based indicators. Management leadership, percent of goals, objectives incorporating safety are leading or input-based indicators. Percent of jobs pre-planned, average number of corrective actions per incident. Some of these are hard to measure, really hard to define. So percent of goals, objectives incorporating safety. The percent of goals, I mean, usually your one goals are going to be like no lost time accidents, something like that. The main thing, and the other things, if you have more accidents but less lost time accidents, you're probably going to be ahead of the game. So lagging, percent of projects without incident, that's pretty. Number of documented meeting compared to target, pre-planned, verified, and on-site safety metrics communicated. That's your lagging. They come afterwards, after it happens. That's under management leadership. Employee involvement, percent of employees involved in safety decision-making process. That's a leading indicator. In other words, you're going to measure those to try to prevent something from accident from happening. Percentage of workforce submitting safe and at-risk observations. That can be, some of the stuff like that can be manipulated by the supervisors. When one supervisor gets all these people to do this, so it looks good, and that blows the whole thing up. Tracking percentage increase or decrease in the number of observations submitted by workers. And that may not be related to anything, but they're important. Somebody is beating on the supervisor about it, so they can get it done. Lagging indicators, number of work method changes, average time to implement suggestions. I'm not impressed by these. New hire orientation and training, percent of employees trained prior to work. Geez, I hope that's 100. If it ain't 100, you've got a problem. Percent of employees and the management trained. Post-training, testing, and competence scores. Okay, number of incidents related to training, percent of training on time following incident, number of training classes conducted. Okay, inspections, audits, and observations, leading indicator, number of inspections and observations, percent of compliance or safe conditions, percent of deficiencies, percent of high-risk observations, percent completion of corrective action within timeline. That's tough too, because if you say it says within timeline, so sometimes you just say completion, but one thing might take 10 minutes, one might take 10 months. Near misses, that's a big problem. Nobody wants to report near misses. If it didn't happen, nobody got hurt, no harm, no fouls, what most people think. They're not going to report them. Incident rate, frequency and severity, lost costs, that's workers' comp usually, average time for corrective action to be completed. Near misses are something that you'd like people to, they should be investigated. You'd like people to report them, but in reality, just doesn't happen. Incidents and observations, average time to complete investigations. Root cause, causal factors. Here we go again, causal factors for root cause. Identified. Number of near misses tracked and investigated. Number of observations tracked and investigated. Okay. Average and lagging indicator, average time for corrective action to be implemented. Repeat incidents, types, and offenders. Now that could be something that's really worth looking at. When you have repeat incidents, it's like certain type of thing, a type of incident, and on repeat offenders too. Performance management. percent of performance measurement reviews measuring success in achieving results. Number of inspections compared to individual objective. Number of safety meetings conducted compared to individual objective. Number of one-on-one contacts. Percent of losses tied to something. I don't know it. I have to get out of this and look at it. Sometimes this doesn't. Oh, tied to projects and individual. Okay. Sometime when you do it, but not on here, it shows up better. Lagging indicators, near misses again, incident rates. Okay, that's a good one. Loss cost, that's a good one. Percentage of overall rating related to safety. I don't know what that means. Safety performance metrics. Project profitability. Okay. Talk about about repeat offenders. OK Foods, Hebner plant. We had this one guy, and he got hired while I was there for 10 years, like 5 different times. Every time he had an accident, and I know what this guy was doing. He was looking to get free, have an accident. His accidents were borderline done on purpose, I always thought. And then I looked to find out before I even got there. Before that, he had every time he got hired, he had an accident. He'd worked there for a few months, have an accident. This guy, you cannot hire this. I think he finally said, do not rehire this guy. So, tools to monitor effectiveness for safety professionals. Risk treatment tracking is generally performed by a risk manager or document owner. There's no specific risk treatment tracking tool provided in ISO standard. So usually it's a spreadsheet with the following headings are suggested: a risk number, you got to give it some identification, the description, the priority, you can use high, medium, low, 1, 2, 3, whatever. Start date, activity, time frame that has to be done, cost to prevent or mitigate risk. It doesn't tell you whether that's an estimated cost or historical cost. Then the end date. For each of the risks that you've identified, you just track them. I mean, that would just make sense. Risk register is a master document created from the output of the risk assessments performed. It is a tool that allows an organization to visually track, evaluate, and manage risk within the operation. Risk registers are used to share risk information with stakeholders and decision makers to inform them of existing and emerging risks within the organization. Risk registers provide a means of communicating risk levels, priority risk levels, risk trends, or emerging risks to decision makers and stakeholders. They can be used to formulate and develop risk treatments or actions needed to reduce or eliminate risks, and be used as a basis for tracking implementation of proposed treatments. A risk register is typically a spreadsheet document or computer database that contains information about identified risk, analysis of risk severity, and evaluations of the possible solution to be applied. Risk registers generally include identifier for tracking, location, department, equipment, task description, hazard identifier, hazard category, description and causes, risk levels from the risk assessment, priority level, additional actions required. And this is an example of a risk register. It has QC lab, plasma cutter here. These are the hazards. And these are the hazards on plasma cutter, electric shock. Current state risk levels are pretty high on these. The red ones are the highest, of course. And the additional controls, yes. And then they put in completion date, really didn't say what they are. And then the future state risk level. Now they've lowered these from the red ones down into yellow or orange, and the orange ones down into green. So doesn't tell you any details about this, and it has completion date on it. So, and that's a good idea. They're listed here, and somewhere along the line, it's good to have a concise list of all of them, so you can look at them without going through a whole bunch of paper. RPM, risk performance measurement. To ensure that risk management is effective and continues to support the organization's objectives, a system for measuring and evaluating risk management performance is required. Risk performance measurement is conducted by qualified objective reviewers to audit, measure key performance indicators, evaluate, and report performance to stakeholders. Its purpose is to determine whether the organization's risk management process is effective or if it needs improvement. Risk management performance should be periodically reviewed and measured to ensure the risk management framework, policies and plan are still appropriate for the external and internal context. In addition, risk performance measures provide decision makers a report on risk, indicating the effectiveness of the risk management plan. This requires a continual improvement process approach in risk management using performance goals, measurement, review, and modification of processes, systems, resources, capability, and skills. Process. Risk performance is driven by the daily performance of critical actions aligned with the organizational objectives. To establish and sustain an effective risk process, it is well recognized that top management must be committed to leading the effort. Risk performance management is a process of establishing and measuring risk and safety-related actions or duties for each level of management and employees. The RPM process is outlined on the next slide. So you can see here that select specific risk and safety actions for each group, management meetings, and all this, and then define tasks and frequencies. And here you do it with these tasks align with organizational objectives, develop instructions for completing tasks, enable groups to perform the task. So you've done groups of the number of the first one. They provide training to the groups, define expectations, develop a dashboard. We'll talk about that in a second. Initiate the process, report quarterly to management. So, tools. This is the again, this is the RPM dashboard. The president of the company participate in occupational safety and health meetings per quarter. Score based on percentage attended. Participate documented in meeting minutes. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Participate in risk assessment reviews with risk assessment team each quarter. Participation documented with decisions made regarding risk treatment options. Meet with plant manager to review his or her scorecard elements. The first Tuesday each quarter. Yeah, those are all good things. Plant manager, same thing, kind of. Department managers, similar. OSH committee meet monthly, etc. With minutes maintained. At least 2 risk reduction action plans in progress. Complete 3 department inspections, 1 per month rotating. That's a real good idea. Conduct 3 prior OSH and risk. Conduct 3 prioritized risk assessment per quarter. You can do more than that. Propose risk treatment options to management for all risk assessments conducted within 30 days. That's a good idea. Conduct risk assessments training to assign team members quarterly. Those are all good stuff on there. Okay, risk. Lagging indicators are important, but they do not drive risk performance. To measure success, the actual steps taken to identify hazards and reduce risk are the focus. An RPM dashboard or scorecard can be used to measure, report, and improve performance by business unit or group. By measuring risk and safety actions scheduled versus actions performed, an indicator of risk performance is created, forming a baseline to track with other measures. And that's all your stuff down there. So you can see this is a lot to the communication of the stuff, reports, and there's a lot of stuff in it. This kind of ties it together a little bit in the risk management process. So we're going to continue with some other stuff here, even though this is the last chapter in this book. We got a lot of other stuff to cover. So in the meantime, I want you all to be safe.